Good morning, everybody. Cornerstone and friends, visitors, welcome to our service this morning. I'd like to invite you to something that we're going to do next Sunday, the 7th of June, a very special get-together over Zoom where we will be breaking bread together. So please keep that in mind. If you need the contact, then please email Cindy and she'll give that to you. So thank you. Now this morning I'm going to take you to a passage in Acts. We are continuing on with our series in understanding the kingdom of God. Now if you remember, we have addressed the issue of globalization, and we've addressed the way that God views that, what he has done about it in the past, starting at Babel, where he divided the kingdom of Satan, and that has been so effective in restraining the forces of evil. Of course, evil is all around, and sometimes it seems overwhelming, but God in his goodness did that all those many years ago, and he continues to do so. And that is our backdrop that we must remember as we read this particular passage in Acts chapter 17. And I'm going to read to you from verse 16. This is about Paul in Athens. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, his spirit was troubled within him when he saw that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and with those who worship God, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Then also some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers argued with him. Some said, "What is this pseudo-intellectual trying to say?" Others replied, "He seems to be a preacher of foreign deities, because he was telling the good news about Jesus and the resurrection." They took him and brought him to the Areopagus and said, "May we learn about this new teaching you are speaking of? For what you want to say sounds strange to us, and we want to know what these ideas mean." Now all the Athenians and the foreigners residing there spent their time on nothing else but telling or hearing something new. Then Paul stood in the middle of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I see that you are extremely religious in every respect. For as I was passing through and observing the objects of your worship, I even found an altar on which was inscribed, 'To an unknown God.' Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, he is Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in shrines made by hands. Neither is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives everyone life and breath and all things. From one man he has made every nation of men to live all over the earth, and has determined their appointed times and the boundaries of where they live, so that they might seek God, and perhaps they might reach out and find him, though he is not far from each one of us." Of course, it was a different world, difficult for us to recognize the world of that day and compare it with our own, but there are certain common things that never change. So we have this division, it's throughout the world. Mankind, they have their own way of worshipping. And some people might not think it's worship. They might just think it's a philosophical idea. They might even have come to the conclusion that there is no God. If that's the case, it becomes self-worship, because they see man as having the answers to all situations. even when there is a pessimism abroad, even when it seems as if maybe humanity has had its day and will come to an end. Nevertheless, there are always those who believe in their own ideas. They seek salvation from their vantage point. There's nothing uncommon about that. It's all around. Always has been. Now, there's something very interesting about this. Because there is this principle of division all around. It's contrary to Satan's idea that maybe one day somehow he will bring the world together as one thought, one idea, one philosophy, one belief system, which is essentially a belief against God and his people. It might have different forms, it might look different in different places, but nevertheless there is this common factor. It's opposed to God. Always has been that way. It's not going to change. And yet there is a scattering. Every time Satan seeks to bring about this false unity against God and his people, it doesn't seem to work. It falls apart. The seeds of destruction are within its own making. And here was Paul. He was an intellectual man. And he'd been talking to the Jews in the synagogues, not getting very far with most of them. He'd been talking to the philosophers of the day. And tongue-in-cheek, because they did not understand, they called Paul, imagine this, they called Paul a pseudo-intellectual. Now, there are clever people in this world. They understand many things that for most of us seem to be without our reach. Maybe because we've not had the training, maybe because we have not examined them, or maybe we just do not quite grasp some of the intricacies of this world. But remember, it is the world that God has made. And there they are. They are the talkers, the thinkers, and actually the way it's recorded, I find this quite interesting. That's all they ever do. Now, of course, if that's all they ever do, they must have had the means to do it. They must have been wealthy. They weren't people who worked. They had their own means of getting on in this life. But they thought and they debated and they discussed, and they came up with some very strange ideas. Now, during this period of time where we have been somewhat isolated from each other, because of the wonderful facility we have in communication today, the internet and what you can find out there. I've been doing a bit of reading, some research, theological research, of people, intellectual people, academic people, PhD kind of people, writing all kinds of ideas about the nature of who God is, who Jesus is, where he fits in all these things. And I have to say that most of it I find to be pseudo-intellectual. I think that some of these folks academically are far stronger than I ever could be. But I read their arguments and I find them convoluted. I find them inaccurate when compared to what God has shown to us through his word. And there is no end to discussion. There is no end to debate. There seems to be no end to many kinds of ideas. But I'm afraid that they do not settle the real issues. But what we have here is a gospel that Paul was declaring. These philosophers were trying to cover every base, so much so that they had a shrine to the unknown God. Well, Paul said, now here's the introduction. You're not doing well with all these other ideas. They are not leading you anywhere. They are not leading you to salvation, the freedom that comes with the gospel. And because of the man he was and his training, he was quite more than adequate in his ability to take them on in the argument. But what he did was cut through the argument and he presented the gospel of Jesus Christ. That is what we must do. Perhaps we do not understand all the ins and outs of the ideas that float around in this world. And it's not a bad thing to think about them, to examine them. But when everything is said and done, there is only one solution. And whatever our background, whatever our training, if we know the true gospel, if we have a real relationship with Jesus Christ through his atoning work on the cross, if we have been made new because of the forgiveness of sins, the removal of guilt, the setting of us free from the bondage of this fallen world, it frees us up in the way that we think and the way that we apply those ideas that come from God himself and God alone. Now, what I find really interesting in all of this is that it is recorded as Paul spoke to these people, he was explaining a principle to them. He was addressing an issue of the nations, the religions of the world, where people lived, where they came from. And of course, when we read a passage like this, we are not looking for some immigration policy politically. It doesn't address that. Throughout the history of this world, people have moved around. They have come from somewhere, of course, but they have moved around. They have left the places where they have their own heritage, their own birth, their own culture, their own families, and they have gone to other places and taken ideas with them. That has always happened, sometimes through conquest, sometimes because it was a free choice. And the fact is that many of us here in Canada, we are actually immigrants. But there is an overriding factor in all of this, is that God is sovereign Lord. Now, of course, in a modern world, immigration is not easy. There are legal aspects. A government can say yes, a government can say no. And some of us, when we came to Canada, it took an awful long time to get through the process. But we are here, and glad to be so. And it's not that somehow in the process of all of that, God has arranged your papers on the desk of an immigration officer somewhere. It's not that God has stamped your file, but there is a bigger principle at work. He is sovereign Lord, and he knows the nations, and he knows the people, and he knows where they come from, and he knows the ideas of the rulers of this world. He knows where they are pretentious. He knows where they are strong. He knows where they are even kind and care for people. He knows all of these things. And of course, as people, we tend to presume that we know exactly what we're doing. We tend to presume that we are free in all of our thinking and then choices that come from that. But it's not quite like that. Of course we have some freedom. That is the way God made us. But maybe He's not as absolute as we presume. And Sovereign Lord is the Lord of purpose. And we are all here because of the gospel, when it is said and done. Whether we know that or not, whether we are opposed to it or we are for it, we are actually all here for the cause of the gospel. As God in His wonderful purposes is pushing the evil out of this world. He's pushing out the darkness and He is bringing His light. And one of the main issues of the division that God put in to mankind at large is the furtherance of the gospel. Now we know that He did it to put boundaries on evil. We've looked at that. But He also did it to facilitate the gospel. And this is what Paul is explaining to these intellectuals, to these clever men of influence, maybe men of power. He's explaining something to them that they are ignorant of, that they have never considered, that really they are not in the place of control, but rather God who is sovereign over all. And He looks upon this world that He has created, and He sees it as the battleground between good and evil. And in all the things that He does in His sovereignty, as much as He gives a certain reign for freedom and for evil for this present time, He is working out His good purposes. And the fact that we have different countries, different boundaries, the fact that people come from different places, it's all part of God's way of bringing the gospel to the world which is fallen. You see, if we were all one nation, if there was one government, and there was one who ruled that government, who was totally opposed to God and His gospel, then what a struggle it would be. But God has divided that up. He has segmented it so that there might be much more access to the gospel of Jesus Christ. That is really what Paul was telling these guys. He's saying, you're thinking about all kinds of things here. And he didn't demean them. In a way, he affirmed them. He said, in a strange way, you're searching for this unknown God, but this is the one that I want to proclaim to you. And Paul, by the empowering of the Holy Spirit, he spoke strong words. He brought the gospel into the very midst of all of the ideas and talk and debate and of opinion. He brought something which is essentially quite simple. The truth that when everything is said and done, at whatever it is that people do, whether they are powerful, strong people, when everything is done, God is sovereign and He has a purpose in this world. And even through all of the differences and divisions, He is at work. And Paul, because he is by nature a great evangelist, he seeks any means by which he can disturb the thoughts of these people, that they might just think outside of their own sphere and way and culture and background. That somehow they might just open their minds to receive the gospel. And that should be encouragement to us, because we are living in a day when there is a lot of move of different peoples and cultures. And it impacts our societies, and sometimes for the good, but sometimes it is not for the good. And we have views on that. We have views on immigration and the policy of all that. But when it is all said and done, God is sovereign Lord. And he uses these things as an avenue for the gospel. And the truth is this, that some people would never have heard of Jesus Christ unless they came into contact with those who know Christ for themselves. And so here is Paul. He finds himself in the midst of this debate. And his answer to it is not in clever thinking or clever words. His answer is simple and straightforward. The sovereign Lord is in control, and he has a solution to this world's problems. And in spite of the very worst that the enemy of God and his people can do, in spite of the worst that any man or woman in this life can do, the gospel is going out there. And God, in his goodness, works through all of that evil and division. He works through all religious ideas in order to expose them for what they are, so that in the end they can be laid aside and only Jesus can be seen. And this is such an encouraging story of this man who stood on his own in the midst of that intellectualism, speaking a straightforward, clear gospel, so that perhaps some, by the grace of God, might be saved. Amen.